Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Road to ERP Success, backed by grant funding. Our webinar today is put on by Fair Grant Writing and Pemeco Consulting, and our speakers will be Igor Chigrin of Fair Grant Writing and Jonathan Gross of Pemeco Consulting. And without any further ado, I'm going to ask Jonathan to jump straight into it. Jonathan.
Well, thanks very much, Colin. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webcast. As I take control of the screen here, I'm going to be presenting for roughly 35 minutes on what it's going to take to deliver one of these projects successfully, things you should be thinking about as you get ready to pick and implement enterprise systems. This webcast is being recorded, and so we will make it available on demand after. There is a question and answer panel, so please post your questions there. We will try to answer them as we work through the presentations, or perhaps towards the end of the presentations if we intend to cover the subject matter. Before I start, if you can see my PowerPoint presentation, that's great. I will let Colin jump in and let me know if I'm sharing my wrong screen. But assuming that you can see the title slide, we're going to get right into it. Very briefly, I'm from a firm called Pemeco Consulting. We've been in business since 1978, helping largely manufacturing, distribution, and retail companies select and successfully implement complex transformative technology projects largely centered around ERP. So our practice is built around helping companies figure out what the future looks like from a business process, from a data and a technology perspective, helping our clients go to market and partner with the right technology vendors and integration partners. We help clients set themselves up for these long-term initiatives by negotiating contracts. And then we help clients get ready and implement and continuously improve the selected software. We've been in business for 43 years. We have managed more than 700 major implementation projects and countless vendor selection projects. We help clients select, implement, and optimize more than 140 different systems. And we boast a 100% success rate when we're the ones managing the project. At any given time, we run with approximately 30 projects, and we have a team of 15. What separates us from our competitors are our methodologies. The methodology we're going to talk to you today about is relating to implementation. This methodology is published, it's used in 40 countries, and really is the gold standard. It's used for small projects, large projects. We'll get into some of the details. The second differentiator is our people, their expertise and their experience. So our team is filled with folks with master's degrees, Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, PMPs, PROCIAD, CAR, change practitioners, and so forth. Let's jump right into it. And so really what we want to talk today is about how your company can get set up to deliver a successful implementation program. And so you may be at the front end of your project saying, I don't even know what systems I want. You could have already picked a system, and you could be midstream through an implementation. Regardless of where you're at, there are certain things you should keep in front of your mind as you're going through this initiative. How do we manage the emotional curve? We're going to talk about what that is and what expectations should look like. We're going to talk about quote unquote governance in teams, organizational change management. We'll talk about the key to this, which is successful business process engineering, and that feeds into the rest of the discussion around how we define what needs to be re-engineered, how we map it, how we test it, ultimately how we migrate data, train others, and we're going to wrap up today's discussion by talking about really how to avoid the 7 deadly implementation sins. The content from today's presentation is really driven and derived from our methodology, Milestone Deliverables. It's used in 40 countries. You can buy it off our website. You can buy it off of Amazon. And I've put hyperlinks there. And really, the methodology starts at the bottom of this pyramid. Establish the objectives and the guidelines, the project plans, the KPIs, the responsibility plans and various other planning documents, and then going through systematically executing those plans. And the way the methodology works is it's designed to take this really big, complex, transformative project and really erect these signposts along the way that allow us to take stock of where we're at and whether we're on the path to success. And so these signposts are what we call milestone deliverables. There are hundreds of things you've got to monitor in a project, but if you really focus on the 14 key deliverables in 13 phases, you'll know you're doing your job properly. And we're going to walk through what some of those look like. But once you've developed the project plans, the next set of phases in the project relate to developing the concepts and mapping, proving them through various piloting, transferring the knowledge by training your organization and the key people on the new ways of doing business, migrating the data and the new technologies, cutting over in a very systematic and controlled way, and then going through continuous improvement once you've gone live to really drive that ROI that the business case says you should be realizing through this costly and risky initiative. Let's start off at the top with the emotional curve, level setting expectations. If you're going through a software selection project right now, you're probably really climbing this curve at the front end when you're starting to see how wonderful these modern systems are and how you can automate things and use workflow and graphical processes and a common master database. So you have one version of the truth, and you really start climbing this curve. You start seeing this can really improve my business. And then what ends up happening is you start going through implementation and you start configuring and testing the system and realize that, you know, this stuff's pretty hard. And in some cases, I've got to click 7 times where all I had to do was update a spreadsheet. But I have to do that because I know that I need someone in accounts receivable to get the data. I need to make sure I get the data in so that I can receive the product, whatever the case may be. So in many cases, your world will get better, but in some cases, it may get harder. The other thing you're going to realize as you start going through implementation is that the system doesn't necessarily do things 100% of the way that you thought it might. So it's going to do most of it. Let's call it 80%, 90% if you've done your diligence properly. But there's certain things it's not going to do. And you got to be prepared for that. And you got to understand that this system is made for thousands and thousands of companies, and it's not custom developed for your own business. So the thing to understand is when we hit a gap, when we hit an issue, it's how we deal with it. It's how we resolve it. It's how we work around it. So it could be, it may require a change request. We're going to talk about how to deal with those and escalate those through the project governance structure. Then what ends up happening is, you know, it gets hard and your team has worked really hard to implement, and then you flip the switch on the new system and inevitably it's really hard. Not only do I have all of these new orders to process, I have to do it in a new system. And yes, I've been trained on it, but it's not second nature as it is for the same process I've been running for perhaps 20 years prior. So I have to adopt this thing. And it's important to understand that it gets better and you climb the recovery curve and really start to drive that ROI, but it takes a long time to adopt it. So your job as senior leaders, project managers, project champions in the organization is to really level set your organization that, hey, this is not easy peasy project. This is a major transformational initiative, and the expression no pain, no gain is apt. So it's going to get hard. We're going to work late nights. We're going to cut over. It's going to take time to adopt, but it's going to get much better. So your job as sponsor or champion or influencer of the project is to manage the curve. It's important to celebrate the wins in the project, but it's also important to temper expectations and say, you know, you're up here right now, but we see a dip coming and it's going to get really hard, and try to, you know, manage the highs, manage the lows, and narrow the sine curve. So understanding the emotional toll is really important. We're asking people to change behaviors, to do things differently, and adopt new tools and do it in a high impact, high performance kind of way. And so that leads really to this concept of organizational change management, which is a term that's thrown about in the industry fairly loosely. It can be fairly esoteric, but if we really drill into what organizational change management is, It's the methods to prepare and support changes to your full organization. It's how an implementation should be run. It covers governance and decision-making, change management, as in managing change requests. It relates to the technical parts of the project with respect to mapping and configuring the system and migrating the data, testing the system, training the end users, and then ultimately making sure that we get adoption. So there are very formal methodologies to make sure that the stakeholders are aligned, but for most of our small and mid-sized clients, focusing on the guts of having strong teams that are built for high performance projects, focusing on mapping divisions of responsibility among the internal project teams and the consultants, and then going through the project plans are critical. So again, back to this concept of governance, and this is really the management framework to make effective project decisions. And we're going to have different layers on or different teams that have different roles. We have to think about communications and how we're going to communicate through the project organization from the core team and project management up to the steering committee, for example, to really make sure that we're in a position to bring the steering committee in to make effective decisions at the right time when something needs to change, or when we have a strategic question that requires senior leadership advice, among other things. We need to think about stakeholder communications with our business partners, our vendors, our customers, regulators if they apply. If we're changing our invoice form, for example, well, we better start thinking about how we're going to socialize that. What about our employees? Our employees are going to say, hey, we're putting in all of this great automation in the company. Does that mean I'm going to be out of a job? Are you automating me out of my job? And maybe I'm going to subconsciously or consciously try to torpedo this thing. It's not in my interest. How do we communicate to the organization to make sure that we keep everyone on the same page? Risks and issues tracking. How are we tracking how the project is going, what the risks and issues are, how we're going to mitigate them, and the impact on the project? Gaps and issues arise. It's part of the project. It's how we deal with them. Are they showstoppers? Or are they something that we should perhaps not delay cutover until? And having a very disciplined approach to deal with this is critical. And then project control, applying the right methodologies and the right measurables in terms of schedule, budget, and other key performance indicators is critical. And so we're going to talk a bit more about that as we progress deeper into the methodology. Before we do that, the project's org structure is absolutely critical. Our methodology calls for an org structure that is really derived from organizational behavior theory around what constitutes a high-performing team. And so if we look at the team here, we've got the steering committee, which is made up of the executives or the senior managers of the company. And this is what the committee does. It steers the project. It applies the strategic direction. So, you know, what are the key benefits? It applies budgets. It applies resources, people to the project, and is ultimately responsible for making sure that the organization knows that there is no more important priority for the company than this project, and that we are applying and dedicating the resources to deliver this. And applying and dedicating the resources means people's time, and it means the company's money. The steering committee is also charged with resolving roadblocks that can't be resolved by the core team. So if there's a change request to add in something new that's going to cause dollars or cause the schedule to slip, well, maybe that needs to go up to the steering committee. And your job as project manager on the core team is to advise the steering committee, hey, this is coming down the pipe. It's going to have an impact of X, Y, and Z. It's going to cost X dollars. And here are the alternatives and the costs, the benefits, the schedule impacts of the alternatives. The steering committee is not a rubber stamp committee. Its job is to take that, assess it, and say yay or nay. And sometimes it's going to be yay, sometimes it's going to be nay. And if you have a well-defined project charter that says, here's what our project looks like, if you have a well-defined project scope that says, here's what we want to achieve, here are the key performance indicators. For example, our key performance indicators to make sure we've got an on-time delivery of 95%. Well, if a change request is not mission critical to that, maybe we punt it to a phase 2. But if it is critical, then maybe it gets folded in. As we move down the steering committee, before I move off, it's important to note, should be meeting no less frequently than once monthly. And in some cases, it meets bi-weekly. Moving down, then we have the project core team. The project management layer sits and straddles the core team in the steering committee. And this is the layer that is responsible for managing the project, for managing change. Attached to the project manager's hip is a solutions architect who should have a strong understanding of how all the dots connect cross-functionally through the system. If I set my sales order up this way, it's going to have this implication on order fulfillment from the warehouse and that implication on invoicing. And really understanding, so whether when we have our customer service or sales functional user designing a process a certain way, the cross-functional solutions architect is in a position to say, hey, perhaps you should think about using this methodology because it's going to drive this KPI or it's going to have this cross-functional impact. Project management. Very, very critical that your company, you being the company implementing the system, owns the project. The vendor or their partner will provide a project manager, but that project manager's role is really to manage their resources and their end of the bargain. Your project manager's role is to manage the entire project, of which the vendor's portion feeds into. So if we think about the whole project, we've got our people's responsibilities, we've got the vendors' people's responsibilities, we've got stakeholder communication responsibilities. Your project manager's task is to drive that and to really understand what happens if people aren't hitting their targets and what we have to do, how to manage change. This is not something you want to outsource on the whole to the vendor or their VAR, because it's really something, it's your project, you own it, you own the deliverables. The vendor is going to roll off and go on to the next project. Their project manager has a mission critical role to play, but it is not duplicative. And it's important to note that your project management function has to own this deliverable, has to own the deliverables, has to own the responsibility, and has to be accountable. Again, you're going to be living with this implementation for hopefully in the next 15 years. And so it's important to understand what your responsibilities should be. So sitting below so just one more comment before I move off project management. Your project manager and the vendor's project manager are going to work very, very closely together. You're going to build a set of plans together that understand who slots in where, doing what the key deliverables look like. And you may take the outside project, the vendor's project management plan, and supplement it with activities and tasks that are critical for your team to complete. So again, having an integrated plan that melds the methodologies is critical. Now, the core team is who does the bulk of the work on an implementation. So you're going to have core team members, subject matter experts, who are going to really have the responsibility for doing most of the lifting. The process mapping, the configuration of the system, the testing of the system, and the training of the end users. The outside functional expert, the vendor's finance consultant or logistics consultant or manufacturing consultant is going to come in and say, our system can do it one of these 5-6 ways. Your core team members responsible for saying this way is the way that's going to work best for our organization. And so again, that functional expert from the vendor side of things is really providing input, and they may provide more or less support depending on how much help you need to, do some of the initial configuration or parameterizations of the system. But again, it's important for your core team to own this. And so with the advice and support of the outside functional expert, and let me give a quick example on why this is critical. So if you were to take, for example, think of your most important national account customer in your organization that accounts for a huge chunk of your sales. Would you outsource that to someone else who doesn't know your business, who has spent a few weeks talking to your key users and learning? Of course not. Now, if we take the same theory and apply it across your entire organization, across all of the business processes, you don't want to outsource that. You want to take ownership over it. We need the expertise from the consultants on, best practices, on which ways may be most suitable, what other companies have done, what their software can and cannot do, but ultimately your people should own it. So there's a lot more we can talk about on teams, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. And I think the key point here is that the consultants or advisors, the consultants, project managers are managing the external team and to an extent managing certain deliverables, but your company should be owning the project management plan, the key deliverables, among other things. So if we break this down in terms of who's doing what, and yes, you know, this is an oversimplification of a project plan and the responsibilities, but in terms of ownership, you know, the plans are jointly developed and owned. We're going to talk about listing business scenarios and understanding what the scope is. That's going to fall on you, the implementing company, to really wrap your arms around the scope. The vendors are going to come in and say, we've got these quote unquote best practices and implementation accelerators to help streamline it, but those are only going to fit a portion of your business scenarios. So the vendor is going to take those, they're going to walk through their system and show you this happy path through the implementation accelerators. Your job is to say, you know, the receiving scenario meets 80% of my requirements. The put away scenario meets 60%. And really, it doesn't really satisfy any of our 5 picking scenarios. And we need to sit there checking this stuff up on the list so that when your core team goes back, it's going to go through this list and do the mapping. And to the extent that we have a really well-fitting implementation accelerator or best practice, it's going to reduce the workload. To the extent it partially fits, well, we're going to have to do some mapping there to fill the gaps. And to the extent it's just missing entirely, well, we're going to have to draft it from scratch. And that stuff really rests with the core team and to be managed by the project manager. Then we move into the piloting and the testing. And again, we want your core team members to be running through the pilots, beating the keyboards, testing the systems, because it's part of the training methodology. It's part of the validation. And again, this is part of the ownership equation. Ultimately, once you've gone through the pilots and we're confident that the system is set up in a way that's going to meet our needs, that it's tested thoroughly, then we bring in extra users from our organization. We do what's called user acceptance testing, where we are doing, in some cases, almost a fake parallel to make sure that, you know, the inputs and the outputs match and the system does what it wants. And it really is, I wake up at 8 in the morning, I turn on my, you know, I log into my system, I run my exception reports, I process my open orders, but it really is the day in the life type of testing. And then we end up training the end users and cut over. While all this is going on, we're migrating data. The vendors are going to come in and say, we've got these migration templates and these tools, but again, customer and implementer company, you typically own the data migration and you need to put people in those roles to facilitate it. And same with project and change management. Now we're going to get into the meat and we're going to get into process mapping and how we make sure that we're not missing something. If you think of, you know, all of these failures that have happened over the history, you've got Hershey's whose stock price fell 17% when they tried to cut over before their busiest Halloween season. You've got Overstock.com that had to restate, I don't know what it was, $5 or $10 million in a future financial statements because they didn't map their warranty return operational transactions to the general ledger. And all of these never hit the GL. And so again, making sure that we're listing the business scenarios, that each one is covered and each one is mapped and tested is a key responsibility. And this is one of those sets of key deliverables that are important for your company to track through implementation. So if you see here, we've got a business scenario list for our warehousing department. And it's going to have all of these scenarios that reflect master data, that reflect business processing. For each scenario, we are mapping the cross-functional touch points. Well, receiving, there's common data that applies to it. It impacts purchasing because we've got purchase orders we're receiving against it, and there's a cross-functional touch point for accounts payable, among other things. And mapping those cross-functional touch points means that we need to bring those cross-functionally impacted departments in to validate the processes. We are modeling and mapping and tracking. The mapping, is the process mapped? Yes or no? Is it scripted? And scripted means test scripts. These test scripts ultimately become your end user instructions. And this is how we're tracking progress through the implementation. So if we flip back to this scenario, the first thing we want to do is list the business scenarios. We're going to go through the IA, the implementation accelerator gap analysis. and we're going to be checking things off. We have maps, we need maps. So then we're going to fill out the maps, and all of a sudden we see our KPIs. Well, we're 80% mapped on warehousing, but only 60% on AP. And now we really know how we're doing on implementation. Our test scripts, we see how we're doing on the test scripting and so forth. This is a key deliverable to track how we're doing on implementation. This is, in many respects, the Bible. Each one of those business scenarios will have process maps attached to it. The process map maps the process flow, and that process flow has, for each step in the process, work instructions. Open up the menu, click here, enter this data. These 5 data fields auto-populate by defaults. Do this, do that. And this ultimately becomes your user instructions and your test scenarios, and it's day in the life. When you build your test scripts, don't just think about testing features and functions and clicking, run through the business process. Eventually, it's going to hand off to the other departments to make sure that those cross-functional touch points work. But again, doing it in a disciplined manner such as this will make sure that we are testing the scenarios and building them in a way that reflects how we're going to be using the system. Piloting, testing, this is critical. One of the key risks on implementation is that we don't test the system properly, that we don't test it enough. And so we advocate a 3-phase testing plan. And these are in addition to the proof of concept or the implementation accelerator walkthroughs that your vendor partner is going to provide. First one is the first conference room pilot. We need to make sure that we're setting up the system and that it can handle our day in and day out requirements. Cutting a sales order, cutting a purchase order, cutting a work order, whatever the case may be. We want to have entered a good sampling of data. And then we want to run through the tests of all those scenarios. We want to make sure they're mapped. And again, we are testing them departmentally. So again, I'm in the warehouse and I'm just going to test. I'm going to receive, I'm going to put, I'm going to pick, I'm going to pack, I'm going to ship, and all the variations of those. I'm not worried at this stage about the cross-functional impacts to accounting and elsewhere in the organization, because if I had to wait for every time I processed a receiving transaction for accounts payable to process the vendor invoice, I'll never make it through. So again, test them vertically. Then this testing phase, expect 20 to 30 days. The next testing phase, well, what we're going to do is we're now going to retest all of our scenarios that we tested in CRP1, because we will have made updates and changes to them. And now we're also going to test our 20s. The 20s are things that we can't predict. You think the 80-20 rule, a warranty return, processing a customer credit, an engineering change request, things like that. So we're going to test those. The other thing we want to test, because now we're progressing to cutover, is development. If we have extensions that we're building, if we have customization, special reports, EDI integrations, we want to have a code freeze. We want to do our unit testing, which means outside of our integrated environment. Then we want to bring that development into our CRP environment and test it to make sure that nothing breaks. This is a really, really critical piece. We have to freeze development at a certain point and make sure that the pieces fit. These are very complex systems. Once we've done that, we may do some performance testing, some load testing, some technical testing, among other things. And then we progress to our user acceptance testing, where we really are now focusing on those streams, the day in the life. How do I run my business process? What are the cross-functional integration points? So unlike the other scenarios where we are testing them vertically through our department, now we're testing them horizontally through a cross-functional type of view to make sure that everything hits the general ledger and the transactions progress through the system. Data migration, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. There's a lot to cover. This could be a webinar in and of itself, but shepherding data across our various environments as we're setting up the data, as we're testing development and extensions, as we're putting things into test environments, requires discipline. It also requires a role on the core team that we call the data governance, data steward, master data management role. And this role is really responsible for shepherding the data and the system settings across the various environments at the right time. From a data mapping perspective, again, understanding how we're going to bring data in is something that should be planned during the initial planning phase. Where does the data reside? Is it clean? What's the status of it? We're going to bring our static data, things like master data files, your customer records, your vendor records, your item records. We're going to bring that in perhaps early. Our more volatile data, the things that are changing, open sales orders, open purchase orders, open shop orders. Well, we need a plan to bring that stuff at the end. We want to close as many of those off as possible before we cut over. We're going to, stop doing business on the Thursday night. If there are orders that can't be closed, well, we may need to manually enter them. We may be able to enter them systematically. But again, data migration is a very complicated piece of the project, and it requires special call out because, again, in many respects, this can cause issues. So I have blasted through critical implementation success factors here. Project setup, understanding roles and responsibilities, governance, process mapping, testing, data migration. All of this stuff is set out in a white paper of ours, and I've included the link here. I encourage you to download it. And it really is designed, it's focused on the negative. Let's put a positive spin on it. It's focused on avoiding the 7 deadly sins. I prefer to look at it as, what do we need to do to drive this thing to successful completion? 1, make sure everyone is supportive of the implementation. Make sure key stakeholders don't resist. So if you are putting key personnel who are so important to your business on the core team, make sure they're backfilled. Make sure that we're communicating. You've chosen the wrong consulting partner. Well, I mean, do your diligence. Don't just look at the software and see that this system has the best workflows and meets our functional requirements. Do your diligence on the partner. Do they have the right skills? Do they have the right fit? Are the consultants available? Your expectations could be unrealistic or ill-defined. You may have vendors coming to you saying, if you're a manufacturing company, this implementation cost you 100, 150 grand. You'll be done in 4 months. Are those realistic expectations? Or, another unrealistic expectation is, I'm not going to dedicate my internal people to this project, and I'll expect the consultants to do that. So again, go in with eyes wide open with the right expectations. Understand, this is not putting things on the vendor. They have a role to play in the project, but this is your project. Understanding what your commitment requirements are, what your resource requirements are, what the project's requirements are critical. Manage change and risk. Again, the steering committee's job is to assess options to understand the full impact. What happens if I go live and I haven't trained my end users? What happens if I haven't properly migrated data? If I haven't properly tested extensions? Every vendor is going to come in and say, hey, we segregate the extension logic from the base code. It doesn't impact upgrade path. I'll tell you, no matter how, it helps a lot. You still have to test it. You still have to test those extensions with the latest release pack. Don't just expect that things are going to work. Things still break. It's a heck of a lot simpler than it is today, but these are very, very complicated systems, and understanding what the risks are and how to manage change is critical. System testing. Again, don't skimp on the testing. Spend the time. If we haven't tested the system properly, push back your go live date. Don't just take a flyer on this that it's going to work even though I haven't tested it, because again, these are complex systems. Communication is poor and the implementation methodology is weak. Again, all of this is in the white paper. I'm going to wrap up. My contact information is here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand the conch back to Colin and Igor. Thank you all very much for your time.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was certainly very enlightening. I think we've all learned quite a bit from that today. And with that done, I'm going to ask Igor to step in immediately to tell us about some of the grant funding options that are available to help fund these sort of migrations. Igor.
So I get started, and in my part, I'll talk about government grants that are specifically for helping companies to adopt ERP solutions and other technology solutions. By the way, a little bit disclaimer that we started the conversation today with the discussion of the budgets and what's coming up for Canadian companies. The reason we did it is because we're at the end of the fiscal year, and many grant programs will only be available after April 1st. But this should not discourage you, because it happens every year. The government, both federal and regional government, will like replenish their budgets after April the 1st. So we will have an opportunity to, the business will have an opportunity to apply for most of those funds after April the 1st. Quick word about fair grant writing. We are a professional business and technical writing firm specialized in government funding applications. We've been around since 2013 and spent hundreds of thousands of hours and secured billions of dollars for our happy clients. Our most notable cases are securing over $3 million in interest-free loan to a aerospace manufacturer in Vaughan, Ontario, and over 300,000 in government grants for a metal fabrication client in Kitchener, Ontario. But this is not a limit, and I wanted to highlight this case that happened just recently in June 2020. This particular company in Winnipeg, Merit Functional Foods, secured in a combination of different government grants, government loans, and the loans from Canadian Crown corporations. So I'm sharing this slide to show you that the only limit to what you can get from the government is really your imagination and the eligibility, of course, because you have to respect certain rules. There are, and you have to have a specific project that the government can fund. Now let's talk specifically about the government funding programs, especially grants that are available for ERP-related projects. So first of all, you probably wanted to start with the assessment and selection of the system, just like John told us earlier today. For this program, for this particular goal, there are two programs. One of them is for businesses in Ontario. It's called CME Technology Assessment, and it provides up to a maximum of $25,000 for the technology assessment programs. To qualify, the applicant has to be a manufacturer located in Southern Ontario and have between 15 and 500 employees. There's a similar program for Atlantic Canada, works pretty much the same fashion. The manufacturers have to be located in Atlantic Canada in order to qualify, but then they can as well get the funding towards the technology assessment program in order to, say, identify the right solution, get the feasibility study, and then also train employees in using of the system to maximize the success of the implementation. Speaking of the implementation, there are also government funding programs for skills training. I have to highlight the difference between training and implementation. So typically training is part of implementation, but implementation also has other expenses. Now these programs are only for the skills training, right? Not for customization, not for data migration. So those are not eligible under these programs. And one of the most popular programs coast to coast everywhere in Canada is called Canada Job Grant. Sometimes this program is called differently in some provinces, but in general, it's still the same program. The program provides between 50% and 100% of the training expenses. And the good thing is that you as the employer choose who should take the training and what kind of training you want to apply for. A quick note about it, about this program is that in Ontario, there is a special rule about the software vendor training. So if you're interested in doing the skills training and applying for a skills training grant to support the vendor training, let us know. We'll point you to the right direction and we'll explain how it works in Ontario. In all other provinces, there's no issue with vendor training. So if let's say you're buying an ERP system from the ERP company and then you get this training from the same company, then you're good to go. In Ontario, there is a nuance about that. Another popular program, this time only works for Southern Ontario manufacturers. It's called Yves Landry Foundation's AIM initiative. This initiative covers the expenses, the training expenses that the manufacturers incur, but it's both the third-party trainer fees and the salaries and wages of trainees while they are on training. So pretty beneficial program if you have a large-scale training. Most of our clients use this type of program either for ERP training or lean training, where you need to train most of the employees, and that's why your training budget is typically very large. Now let's talk about the grants for software and hardware implementation. A couple of initiatives I wanted to highlight here. One for agri-food sector. Under Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program, there is a special fund to help food and beverage companies systems. Unlike the skills training grants, these grants actually cover not only the training cost, but also the cost of software itself, the cost of all advisory, consulting, or implementation fees, setup fees, one-time setup fees, and so forth, and training as well. Right? In case if you are a food and beverage manufacturer anywhere in Canada, you typically can get 35% of the project expenses, up to $100,000. Now, the intake dates vary by province or territory, so you have to consult with the intake dates of your local Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program. The automotive industry also has its own program called Ontario Automotive Modernization Program. It's designed specifically to help Ontario-based small to medium-sized automotive manufacturers to implement ERP systems and other type of hardware and software that will make them more productive. And that's the key here in order to qualify for this program. The intake is currently closed, but we expect this program to be renewed under the new budget. So by all means, please stay tuned, and we'll update you about the budget developments. The program provides 50% of the project expenses up to a maximum of $100,000. Outside Ontario, the popular program in Quebec is called SME in Action. This program is also specifically designed for ERP to cover the partial cost of ERP implementation, training, and the cost of the software itself. The government of Quebec provides 40% of the project expenses up to a maximum of $50,000. In other provinces, there are also similar initiatives. In Prince Edward Island, for example, there is an IT implementation assistance. It's not just for ERP system, it's for all sorts of software that the PI companies may be willing to adopt, but of course it's used a lot for ERP implementations. And a similar program in Newfoundland and Labrador as well. If it's a small business in that province employing less than 100 people, that business is eligible for support of hardware and software acquisition and implementation. And the Newfoundland government provides support expenses up to a maximum of $100,000. We just covered specific grants that cover ERP projects. However, I wanted there are other purposes that you can get the government funding for. And especially when it comes to the business expansion. For example, if you are at a point that you are expanding your business, especially when we talk manufacturers, expanding your plant, then you most likely will qualify for the expansion grants, and your ERP project may be a part of that expansion grant. So even if you notice that, for example, there's no ERP grant open at this time for your industry, let's say you're automotive and the intake is currently not open, it doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It just means that we'll have to look holistically at your strategy and see if you see if we can use other type of funding for other purpose to eventually help you out with your ERP, your ERP project. Just keep in mind that the government does not provide operational funding. You have to have a certain project in order for government to consider you as the applicant. And that's then now we're coming to the end of our presentation, my part of the presentation. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I wanted to tell you that at Fair Grant Writing we have a free eligibility check form that's located at fgwinc.ca/eligibility, and you can fill out that form, and then we'll get back to you free of charge. I will let you know. We'll let you know what kind of grants are available for you free of charge, and then we'll hopefully discuss about helping you out with a grant application. Over to you, Colin.
Okay, thank you, Igor, and thanks again, Jonathan. I think we've gotten quite a bit of information here today. And what I'm going to do for you is we're straight into the question and answer. And Igor, there is a question in the chat from Farzad. If you could have a look at that for me, please.
Sure.
All right. He's asking, is the food trading business able to apply for the Canada agricultural
yeah, good
grant?
question. The way the rules say right now, unfortunately, no. Only producers, i.e. farmers, and food and beverage manufacturers qualify.
Okay. All right. What I'm going to do, my screen is just a little bit off here. I'm going to open up the floor. I'm going to turn on everyone's, well, I'm not turning on your microphone, but I'm going to make it so that you can unmute yourselves and ask your questions directly or make comments. So as I'm going through it, just have a quick look at your mute button, see if it's open to you. Yeah, so everyone, you are now able to click on your microphones and unmute to ask any questions. And I think, Igor, you had mentioned in your presentation that there was a nuance about accessing vendor training with the COJG program in Ontario. Could you expand a little bit on that,
Yes,
please?
absolutely. So unlike other provinces that also have the job grant programs, there is a special rule in Ontario that you cannot apply for the grant, for the Canada Ontario job grant, to get the training from the same company that sold you a software or equipment. In other words, if you purchased an ERP system and there's a training involved in it, which of course is involved in it, and the same company that sold you an ERP system offers that training, you can still go ahead and do it, but in this case, it wouldn't qualify for the grant. However, if you, say, purchased an ERP system from a vendor, and then a third-party company will do the training for you, the company that is not affiliated with a particular trainer, then you can apply for the COGG and it will be eligible. So that's, I think, why working with a trusted consultant, trusted partner is very important. Not only you get kind of the best possible ERP solution implemented, but also you can take advantage of the skills training grant because the consulting company is independent and it's not part of the vendor company.
Okay, thank you for that. Jonathan, I listened to your presentation with quite some fascination, and it was a bit of a lot to learn. My background is marketing, so this sort of thing, while it is fascinating, it's not my area of expertise. But I would ask you this. What would be the single most important bit of advice you would give a company that is looking to either adopt or migrate to a new ERP system?
Get ready. It's big, it's transformative, and getting ready means understanding what it's going to take to deliver this thing successfully. And I think really encompasses those major points that I highlighted earlier about setting expectations and having good plans and testing and migrating data. Just make sure you're ready and ready to deliver the project successfully.
Okay, thank you. I particularly noted the examples that you made with those two companies that were very negatively affected, Hershey's in particular. Halloween would not be the time to be caught with your candy store not working the way you wish. Igor, do you have any final thoughts?
Not really. Just one thought that when there is a government funding for you, you should apply for it as soon as possible, because as you have seen in the presentation, there are situations when the government grant programs run out of money. So don't delay. When there is a grant for you, apply.
Yes, that's actually very good advice. It ties into that old analogy that we're all taught as youngsters: strike while the iron is hot. Jonathan, do you have any final thoughts?
Hey, no, I mean, there's, other than, set yourselves up to do this well, there's great funding options available, and I'm happy to have any discussions with any of you as the need arises.
Yes, yes, indeed. And that brings us basically to the end of our webinar today. I would like to, before I do the final wrap up, just like to let you all know that this is one in a series of webinars that are being put on by Fair Grant Writing and its various partners to educate you on some of the issues that are out there with regards to both the availability of grant funding and specific technical areas that may apply to your various businesses. Please take a moment to visit our website at fairgrantwriting.ca, and to the far right of our banner, you will see an events tab. Please click on that and you can see the events that we have coming up. I'll just let you know of one quick one coming up. On the 18th of March, we will be presenting with Conscious Assets. The topic for that webinar will be building the asset performance loop supported by government funding. I do hope you take the time to have a look at the website and perhaps register to attend that event. So with that, I say to Jonathan, thank you very much for your presentation, and Igor, thank you as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.